Today we're talking all things wide-angle lenses in large format photography. Hey there, and welcome to LFF. My name is Matt Marrash, and if this is the first time you're stopping by the channel, there's a playlist of the fourth season that we're currently working on. And if you haven't subscribed yet, each and every Friday, we're gonna be here and we're gonna be chatting about something large format photography. You know, my calendar reminded me today that we are just over 2 years in to this little experiment that is LFF. I thank you all so much for everybody who's continued to support the show, watch, share, subscribe, all of that good stuff. It means the world to me that so many folks are interested in the large format, engaging with the content, and giving me suggestions and sending in cameras, and just, it's so awesome. So far above anything I could have imagined that it would become. So again, thank you. So when you're starting to work with wide-angle lenses on large format, there's two important considerations that I'm going to break down a little bit further in this video. That is the lens choice and the camera choice. Each one of these is going to impact one another, and depending on where you end up, you may have different things that you're limited to because of the camera or because of the lens or both. So the first major consideration for wide-angle lenses on large format is which wide-angle lens are you going to choose? Let's start with 4x5. Anything shorter than about the 135mm focal length, so 120, 110, 105, 90, 75, 65, 58, 47, those are all going to be wide-angle lenses. The shorter that focal length gets, the wider that field of view is going to need to be to cover that larger film format. Depending on what online chart for equivalency you look at, you're going to need a crop factor of about, what is that, 0.28 to 0.3, meaning you can take your favorite 35mm focal length and multiply it by about 3, and that's going to give you the 4x5 equivalency you'll need. For 8x10, you're going to want to take those focal lengths and multiply them roughly by 6, or take the 4x5 one you like and multiply it by 2. And again, that's because we have that larger diagonal to cover on that lens. In addition to which focal length we choose, we're also going to have to think about maximum aperture. Not all lenses are going to be designed the same. Some lenses are designed for size and portability, like this one. This little 90mm Angulon is fantastic because it can fold up into the bed of really compact field cameras. Now, that's not the only 90mm there is. There's plenty of other designs, all depending on what you're trying to do. 6.8 on a standard ground glass like we have on the back of this can be really dim to see. So some folks may want to go for an optical design that opens up that aperture to f5.6 or sometimes even f4.5 to be able to view it brighter on the ground glass. This is going to cause the design of the lens to become a little more hourglass-like. Let me show you an example. I don't have a differently designed 90 on me, but I do have my 150 for my 8x10. This one has one of those hourglass type designs in order to help maintain a constant 5.6 that covers my 8x10. So generally, as the maximum aperture gets to a lower and lower f number on that wide angle lens, the bigger and probably pricier it's going to become. So we've got focal length, we have max aperture, and then we also have to consider image circle. Not all lenses that happen to be at a certain focal length are going to cover the format you're looking for. What I recommend is if you're interested in a particular large format lens, try to search for the data sheet of that particular lens. So for example, this would be a 90mm f6.8 Angulon, and then I'd add data sheet, all one word, and maybe PDF to see if I can find some more data. In the 4x5 realm, you're going to have to worry about coming across lenses that may cover a format down, which would be 3¼ by 4¼ or even 2x3 medium format lenses. If the lens looks too small or too good to be true, yeah, it may not cover the 4x5 format. As you go up and up into the larger formats, 5x7, 8x10, and ultra large format, image circle becomes critical. Let me show you an example. This lens, this Schneider 121mm f8, is actually a 5x7 lens. This is not a lens that was designed for 8x10, but because it's an older single-coated optic, it does have just enough in its design to squeeze out, just barely covering 8x10 at infinity. But its image circle does not permit me to do any sort of camera movements. Because this is capable of covering 8x10, it's more than capable of moving down a format. So some folks, if you want to hedge your bets to go up a larger format, you can, overbuy on the lens side, but look at this. It's almost as large as the camera it's going on, so take that into consideration. When we start using wide, super wide, and ultra wide angle lenses on our large format camera, we're naturally going to get some vignette from that lens. Sometimes that's a really favorable thing, and other times we just don't want to see it. This is especially critical if we're shooting things like E6 transparency films and Polaroid or instant type films. On this big guy, my Schneider Super Simar XL, which is my 150mm, or if this was 4x5, it'd be like a 75mm lens. Even if I stop this giant lens all the way down to like f/22, I'm gonna get a slight bit of vignetting on the corners. If I'm gonna shoot a really expensive piece of color film on this particular lens, I might not want to risk having super, super dark corners. One way I can work a little bit against that is by using a center filter. This is a center filter. This is a graduated neutral density filter, so it has more gray or neutral density in the center of the image, and it kind of fades out. So we're going to permit less light from the center, and that's gonna attempt to even out the overall exposure when I'm using my wide-angle lens. Now, admittedly, I don't use this filter a lot because I don't shoot as much color film. But when I do shoot color film, this is a great thing to have on me. Downside, because it is a neutral density lens, I'm gonna have to compensate for that exposure that I'm losing due to this. Center filters are not for the faint of heart when it comes to the pricing on these. They're pretty rare, and a lot of them have been discontinued, so you're searching the used market for them. So with our lens considerations out of the way, let's move on to the cameras themselves. Starting with press type cameras. Press type cameras, especially ones that have a folding bed where they can collapse into themselves, are excellent cameras for traveling around, but they are some of the most limited when it comes to working with wide-angle lenses. So right now I've got my 90mm lens focused to infinity on this Graflex Crown Graphic. Now, press cameras were designed to take lenses typically from 65mm of bellows draw all the way out to about 300mm. Some press cameras will allow shorter, some press cameras will allow longer, but that's generally the range. But if I go wider than 90mm on this particular camera and push that back, that field of view is so wide, I'm gonna start to see the front couple of inches of the bed in the shot. In order to avoid that, some of these cameras like the Graflex Crown Graphic, Linhof Technica, Wista 45D, lots of different press cameras give us the ability to actually take these same springs that open up the camera and drop the bed. I also have this rear tilt, which allows me to come back up with that. You know, the first time I saw this drop bed design, I was like, this is so freaking cool. It's really an ingenious thing. So there's not a ton of movements on this camera, but just enough to be able to shoot that wide angle and just get the bed out of the shot. Really neat. All right, so with our press cameras out of the way, let's talk about how this applies to field cameras. So this is my 8x10" Tachihara folding field camera. This is a rack and pinion style camera, meaning that I have these gears on the right and left. One side unlocks, one side pushes and pulls the standards. The bellows in this configuration are roughly set for a 300mm lens, or about a standard 12" lens. I've actually got two ways to focus wide angle lenses on this camera. If I take the rear standard, I can actually push it further up the rack to allow a wide-angle lens to be focused. And doing this, I can actually get all the way up to about a 75mm lens. Now, I personally don't own a lens that wide, but if I did, I could focus it. Only downside though, if I were to do that, I don't have a whole lot of room to do any of these things that make large format. I don't have a whole lot of those camera movements. I can also push the front standard backward. Now, if I want to put a wide angle lens on here and push the front standard back, I can't do it using the bed because I only have about an inch of travel. What I have to do is unlock my base tilt as well as my front standard rise and fall and actually push that tilt back and then push it up. Here's why you won't see me doing this too much on the channel. When I put a hefty lens like my 150 on here, I have to make sure everything is tightened really, really, really far down. These have to be all the way tight, and if these are even just a tiny bit loose, this whole assembly starts moving around. When I first got this camera, I didn't know I could push the rear standard up, and I had a whole bunch of pictures taken like this, and I was getting a lot of minute shake because I didn't tighten these guys all the way up. And these little knurled knobs dug really deep into my fingers. I don't play the guitar, so I don't have enough calluses for tightening that down. So I opted for the other way, where I push this standard a little bit further forward. And a configuration like this showcases one of the big limitations of field cameras. Not all field cameras have the ability to change out the type of bellows. Now, if you have a field camera that has a fixed tapered bellows or doesn't have a standard that can push in this far, you may need to look for some added accessories to help you push that lens closer to the film plane. One such tool is a recessed lens board. A recessed lens board is exactly like it sounds. There's the lens board where it mounts, and then there is a recess that's dug into it to push the entire assembly in a few millimeters. I think this one's I think this is a 20 millimeter push, so it pushes nearly an inch back close to the film plane, and that could be the difference between hitting infinity focus and completely missing out. My 2 cents, I am not a big fan of recessed lens boards because a lot of these wide-angle lenses, especially this one, are already hard enough to operate with full access to the lens controls, and having them push back further makes it really hard to manipulate, change shutter speed, set aperture, that sort of thing. An added tool that's out there to help with the use of recessed lens boards or wide-angle lenses where everything's pushed far back, you can also find these tiny little tools. These are cable release extensions. This is going to thread into the cable release port. This little extension makes adding and removing cable releases to these recessed lenses or just older style shutters a lot easier. These little guys can be really expensive though. Last I checked, some of these cable release extensions are around 50, 60 bucks. And yeah, if you just get the right design camera that's going to fit around the lenses you plan on using, you can save yourself some added money for recessed boards and these extra little extensions. But you know, more power to you if you want to go that way. Now I know what you're thinking, what if my large format camera doesn't have the ability to rack those standards closer and further from each other? Well, you may not be out of luck. There are some field cameras that are designed specifically for wide angle, like non-folding cameras and some of the earlier tailboard style cameras. My first 8x10, the Eastman Commercial B, it actually allowed me to fold the front standard up onto the camera and allow me to use that same 121 millimeter lens on a camera that was way older than it, and it was just fine. And on the very high end, there are some field cameras that allow you to change out the bellows from a tapered style bellows to something I'm going to show you a little bit later, a bag style bellows. Okay, so we've talked about wide angle lens considerations, field cameras, press cameras. We got one more camera type to cover. All right, it's time to talk the big boys, monorail cameras. So I'm just putting on my extension column here and adding my Cinar pan tilt head and the base rail for my Cinar. All right. One rear standard, one front standard. Uh-oh, that is not a lot of space right there, but we do have something to do the job. If you want to work with wide angle lenses on a monorail camera, you got to get a bag bellows. Well, you don't have to, but it's going to make life very easy. So it's going to clip in here, it's going to clip in here. So even though it's big and obnoxious, the bag bellows is supposed to come out beyond the constraints of the front and rear standard, and that's going to allow free movement of those standards to maximize image circle and not potentially cut it off. So when I pop on my super wide angle here, I can do, well, any movements that are possible due to the image circle, and I'm good to go. Another thing to think about if you're going to do this stuff with a monorail, not all monorail cameras have shorter base rails, so you'll want to find one that has a base rail that's going to match wide angle photography. If I have a long rail, kind of like the bed of the camera, I may have that in the way of the shots. Now there are also wide angle specialty cameras like the Silvestri S4 that we talked about back in season 3 of LFF. and some other types of cameras that have a fixed body, kind of like this pinhole camera, which is always wide, and the box is built to accommodate those super wide fields of view. You also have cone style cameras that are specifically designed, like the Cameradactyl OG, the Harman Titan XL, etc., etc. And those, well, they're made for wide angles, so those considerations are already taken care of, but you may be limited to the look or the type of lens that you can place on those cameras. So with all those considerations in mind, here's a couple of tips when you're working with wide-angle lenses on your large format camera. This first one may be a bit counterintuitive. Typically when you set up a tripod, you want to have those legs so you're not tripping over anything and not straddling a tripod leg. But if you have your tripod leg jutting too far out in front of that wide-angle lens, you might see that tripod leg in the shot. So try to position your head, if you have a pan-tilt head, so that the two front legs are kind of parallel with that front standard. If you can't avoid it, try to do some movements or positioning so you don't get those tripod legs in the shot. And another thing that can happen when we're focusing large format lenses really close, it can be easy to have a lot of bellows extension factor without us even knowing it. So if your subject matter is rather close to the camera, within a few meters or less, that bellows draw, it doesn't look like it's going very far, but you could drop off as many as 1 or 2 stops of bellows extension factor just because you're getting up close. This is especially important in macro and tabletop type photography. So that's a few things to keep in mind when you're working with wide-angle lenses in large format photography. What's your go-to wide-angle lens on your camera? Do you like a super wide? Do you like something ultra wide? Have you used a specialty lens that requires a special camera? Let me know down below in the comments. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to drop me an email, largeformatquestions@gmail.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we'll catch you next week for more LFF.